in this paper, I'm looking at the question of how negative income shocks and differences in relative income affect preferences for redistribution. And the motivation for this project really came from observing that over the last years, first during the crisis due to COVID-19, and more recently the cost of living crisis, we've seen a lot of public and political debates surrounding inequality and fairness. And the question that I was then asking myself is, maybe these times of crisis do not only lead to an increased concern or saliency of these topics, but may lead to a general shift in how people view fairness and redistribution in general. And then one particular aspect that I'm looking at in this project as well is that not everyone is affected equally by a crisis. In particular, I'm looking at differences in relative income, as several studies have shown that often the poor are particularly affected by a crisis. And to answer these questions, I'm using an experimental approach. Answering this question with observational data has several challenges because your exposure to negative income shock will be correlated with a whole range of socioeconomic characteristics, and especially then when looking at the interaction between negative income shocks and differences in relative income, you would need kind of a double natural experiment to investigate this question. So I'm taking an alternative route here, and I'm isolating exposure to negative income shocks and whether you're relatively rich or poor with the help of an experiment. What I find in my study is that, first of all, relative income matters a lot for how people want to share resources within the context of the experiment. In particular, the poor, they demand much higher levels of redistribution compared to the rich. And then I also find that whether you're rich or poor affects how people respond to negative income shocks. I find that only the rich respond to income shocks, and they do so in the following way. If they affect themselves by a shock, then they become more selfish and are willing to redistribute less towards the poor. But if they learn that it's mainly the poor that are affected, then they actually become more generous and are willing to redistribute more. So depending on who's affected by a crisis, this may both generate barriers or opportunities for redistribution. And then I'm also running a follow-up study where I'm not looking at random variation in income shocks within the experiment, but I'm giving people information about what happened to the person they're interacting with during COVID-19. And I find very similar patterns, meaning that people take both own and other shocks into account, becoming more selfish after shock to self and more generous after a shock to the other person. So overall, what the study shows is that people care a lot about whether someone is relatively rich or poor, and also changes in income matter a lot for how people view questions of redistribution.